Okay, it looks like we're recording. So, thanks for joining us today for a delayed monthly call. We normally do this the first Monday of the month, but I was at a conference, and then the following week I got called into a meeting to present that I wasn't allowed to miss. So we got pushed back another week. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility. Wanted to take this time to let JD talk to us a little bit about the work that she's been doing with Capital Metro in Austin, Texas. Just a little background, JD and I go back a long ways. We helped set up the initial bike share system under a B-cycle system in Austin. I was the executive director and JD was my operations director. Back in 2013, JD had come from helping to set up the system in San Antonio, and then after a couple of years working with us, got lured back to be the executive director at the San Antonio system, and just seems to be going back and forth up I-35 between Austin and San Antonio. So now works with Capital Metro in Austin, and has been there as there's been a transition that's happened. It was a city-owned system run by a nonprofit, and um, I'm still a little unclear, so maybe you can talk about this, about how kind of the transit system works with all of this. But there's been this transition to having really the transit agency take over, really driving the program. Still a partnership with the city, I believe, but really kind of a different relationship. I think just JD, for a little background on what's happening, has been happening in Minnesota. We had the Nice Ride system that was originally run by a nonprofit and then managed by Lyft. At a certain point, the title sponsor backed out of that program, and Lyft was not in a position to continue running the system and had trouble finding a replacement. So that system shut down. So now in the Twin Cities, we have um, um, permitting systems, kind of similar to Austin with dockless bikes and dockless scooters, but we don't really have a local public system. But we are having conversations now, and I think we've put in for, as a work group, there's been a grant that's been put in to do some planning around, a possible federal grant to do planning around bringing back a public bike share system. And so really thinking about all of the different things that might be involved in that, partnerships, who runs it, that sort of thing. So that's just a little lay of the ground. Hope to, this is a good introduction for you, and maybe just kind of take it away and let us know. Well, we decided not to do slides, make this more of a conversation. So
Mhm.
really kind of up to you how you want to take this, but I'll interject with questions as we have them. So
Oh, okay, great. Thanks,
yeah,
Elliot. Good to see you again.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I'll try to go chronological to a point. So, as Elliot said, there was that partnership between the City of Austin and the nonprofit. We installed stations starting in 2013. And then Cap Metro, as the transit agency, was always kind of a partner in some form or fashion through many of those years, kind of like as a sponsor. And then in 2020, Cap Metro started thinking about maybe we want to have a stronger relationship, because the one thing that was kind of lacking is we wanted to integrate bike share into transit. And it was really hard to do without Cap Metro taking the reins to a point. And so there was an expansion plan kind of, uh, work done in, I think it was published in 2021, talking about what this would look like. And then, of course, there was a business plan that said, what would it look like if Cap Metro took over the operations of the program? So instead of being kind of three-legged with, the City of Austin, Cap Metro, and the nonprofit, Cap Metro took over the nonprofit. That all closed down. And in August of 2022, started integrating bike share into the operations. So where we stand right now is the city still owns the hardware. the bikes and the stations, and they get funding, through federal and state grants for that. Then Cap Metro became the operator. And we had, there was a contract with B-Cycle as the hardware provider, and that contract was between B-Cycle and the city of Austin. So what Cap Metro decided is, okay, we're going to take over the operations, but we also want to be in control of that contract. Our contract with B-Cycle ran out this year, and so we decided to do an RFP to look, and I guess that would have been in late 2022, to do an RFP to look at what else is out there as far as a vendor and what the needs of Cap Metro were. So we wanted to go to an all-electric e-bike fleet. So that kind of rolled into having the ability for the stations to connect to the grid and be electrified. An all e-bike fleet with a manual approach to, charging and all of that is very cumbersome. And so we knew we wanted a vendor to do that. So that was a big piece of the RFP, along with some other things. So the RFP launched in 2023. We went through that entire process and selected PBSC, which Urban Solutions, as our vendor. And so that started this year, earlier this year, I think March. And so we started the plan for replacing all of the equipment and all of the bikes. And I'll back up a little bit. What we did, what the transit agency decided is to have the operations, specific day-to-day operations, field work, all of that would be under our demand response department. And, they do pickup and all of that. And so what I was hired to do, I'm in the planning department. And so I was hired to launch this RFP, select a vendor, and do the planning around this change as well as expansion. We had a 10-year expansion plan in 2021. I am wrapping up our update to that probably by September of this year. So we're looking at how the program can expand. We're at around 80 stations now, and the 10-year plan is to go to about 300 and about 3,000 bikes. So lots of discussions around that, and it was determined to break up the job, if you will, and not have that in operations, but actually have that in planning, which has worked really well because in collaborating within planning for bus stops and shelters and all of that, and how can we integrate bike share into these updates and expansion of like the bus and rail and trails and all of that. So it was a little confusing at first for everyone, but I worked hand in hand with the operations director, and we've known each other for a long time as well. So it was pretty easy for us to figure out what would be my role, what would be his role, and how do we interact. So it's a very important to have that collaboration and that communication between planning and operations, which in many cases in the transit agency was not, that communication wasn't as strong. And so things were happening in planning, and then operations didn't understand it, on the bus stops and shelters and things like that. So we felt like this would be a good relationship. So that's kind of how we did it. And like I said, at first it was a little confusing for the Cap Metro to understand, like, what did I do? What did operations do? But we found it to work out really nicely. So I do all kind of like the planning and the removal of the B-cycle equipment and what to do with it, and then the actual installation. Working obviously with operations and PBSC to replace all of the stations this summer. And then starting in 2025, we will start adding and expanding the program. And the city received a TASA grant, which was through TxDOT and the federal government on the transit set aside. I can't remember what TASA stands for. And so they received about $11.3 million to expand the program or the system itself, hardware, software, and some other expenses. And then there was we have a 20% match on that the city came up with. And we have an ILA, an interlocal agreement with the city on who's paying for what, how it all works, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of questions came about why Cap Metro wanted to actually do the RFP versus the city. And we wanted the ability to kind of control the software and be able to control what was happening as opposed to this, disconnected conversation with the vendor. So we took that on. Lots of difference of opinion on whether it should have stayed with the city or with us. But we have this interlocal agreement, and so all of that was kind of mapped out, like what are we responsible for in duties as well as financial responsibility. And I think that brings us up to date. So I don't know what other questions anyone might have.
I'll jump in just as people are thinking about what they want to ask and just say one of the things, I guess 2 questions that are about stations. Mm-hmm. One of the advantages that we had when we were setting up the B-cycle system was that the equipment belonged to the city. So it was mm-hmm. We were putting city equipment into public space. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have to go through special permitting or anything. It was like, similar to if the city wanted to put, a bench or something mm-hmm. that they owned. I guess, is that one of the reasons, or still the case, why you've got the city ownership versus Capital Metro owning the whole system?
Oh, yeah.
Or what was the reasoning kind of behind, as Capital Metro is coming to the table and wanting to mm-hmm. take over more and more, you still kept this sort of one side owning it and the other side on the operations?
Yeah. Several reasons. One, as you mentioned, with the city owning it, then the permitting and having access to the right-of-way was critical. And so if Cap Metro took over all of that, then, as you said, there's special permitting and the process just takes a whole lot longer. Also on the electrification side of things, we're through the city, we're working with Austin Energy to get that. So it kind of streamlines a lot of that bureaucracy, if you will. And also, the city has access to federal and state funding that we do not. So to have them continue to own that was an important factor.
And then they're providing the match too, right?
Yes, and they're providing the match and all of that. Absolutely. And they're also bringing O&M, operations and maintenance funding. All of that's kind of outlined in the ILA as to what we're contributing and our responsibilities, and then what the city is contributing and their responsibilities. And since we've all kind of worked together for so many years, it really was not as difficult. You know, their understanding of bike share and having had that relationship in the past, I think made it a little bit of a smoother transition by keeping it separate. So we say they own the system and we operate it. So we're just kind of basically the operator of the program.
Yeah, just to clarify for folks, Austin Energy in Austin, Texas, the city owns the utility.
Right.
The city council is the board of directors of the utility. So it's a little bit, and actually provides a operational surplus to the city that, in addition to property taxes and things like that. So it's a little bit different situation than most cities. Well, anyway, I don't want to monopolize this. Do other folks have questions for JD or things that this has brought up that you might want to hear more about?
Okay.
Go for it. If you got a
My
question,
mic is
just
on.
ask.
All right. I've been right on the whole time. Okay. So just on financing, how much, what percentage is based on the grants and how much is the city or the state putting into the program to keep it running?
So basically the state funding is for the actual equipment. Okay. And so, yes. And so there's a little bit of money in there, like for permitting and a couple of little things like that. But in essence, the bulk of that is used for the purchase of the equipment. And then the operational piece falls on Cap Metro, and with, some supplement through the city. It's not a lot, but it is, it is some. And they provide us other things that it's kind of hard to quantify, because they get through and they do all of the permitting and they kind of negotiate and kind of streamline some issues for us, and which is really nice. And so, it's in some cases it's kind of hard to quantify, but we as Cap Metro, we all kind of have limits spelled out in the ILA as to how much Cap Metro is contributing, how much the city is contributing. And apologies, I can't really give any numbers today. We're in the final draft of an updated ILA. We had to update it because of the TASA grant and the change of vendor and all of that. So we're finalizing that, and hopefully our plan is to get that to the board and city council at the end of September. But we just felt like that was like the easiest and the most streamlined approach is to do it and enhance the interlocal agreement.
Go ahead. How many bikes do you have right now?
Well, right now we have about 500, and we have 76 stations. Okay. And then, so we just did kind of a minimal amount to replace the current system. And from a planning point of view, it was pretty intensive in, we had the B-cycle locations, and many of those had literally been there for 10 years. So we went out and did a new evaluation of our station locations. And does it still fit the need? Does it still make sense? What kind of issues that could arise? And so we took all of that and all of that data and said, okay, yes, we can pick up a station and put one down in the exact location. And in some of those, that did not work. So we had a lot of that kind of thing happening in the early days, making this transition.
And they're all e-bikes too?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. And, that was through a lot of conversations within, really within the nonprofit before it came over to Cap Metro. There were a lot of interest. A lot of people really wanted to have an e-bike. It was always that difficult situation where somebody's looking for an e-bike and, that kind of thing. So it became very clear. So we were launching that way. I do know a couple of cities like Chicago, where some are dropped off, I can't think. They had e-bikes and also the standard acoustic bikes because that is what, their city wanted and their ridership. Most of those that have done that are more flat than Austin. We are in the hill country. Granted, it's not mountains, it's hills. And so it seemed very important to start out that way. We haven't ruled out the possibility that maybe down the road we might bring in some acoustic bikes. There's lots of conversation about adaptive bikes. There's a lot of that. So we're not being very stagnant with that decision. This is just how we're going to launch, and this is how we're looking to do the expansion in the short term, and then we'll see, what the community and what makes the most sense moving forward.
And just to clarify, the B-cycle system was a mixed. You had a mix
Yeah.
of e-bikes and regular pedal bikes, but it started it started before e-bikes, so it was, or if you were adding those later. So, David had a question.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm with the city of St. Paul. Thanks for presenting today. This is really interesting. I picked up on one thing you kind of alluded to briefly, JD. You said that there's been some discussion about sort of who sort of owns and plans for these things, and it's not something that we've had to deal with that much yet. But I think we've had some high level discussions where I feel like we have several transit operators, but our large one is Metro Transit, and there's kind of like it's like a arm's length discussion saying like we have certain rules that are statutorily limited for what we're allowed to do, and not that they don't want to talk to us, but I think they might have to be told by the legislature that they're going to do this kind of thing. I'm not sure how exactly it would work, but it's down the road. But I'm just curious about what some of those discussions were.
Yeah, and quite honestly, it started with basically 3 people within Cap Metro. Thankfully, one of the 3 was the president at that time, who said, we want to integrate this. We've got transit deserts, and how is the best way to do this? And really, it came down to Cap Metro really seeing this as a benefit. And how we can solve some of the issues that the agency has in providing service. And so it really just kind of started that way. And, and then there was a lot of discussion internally and with the city, about how would this look, how would it work? What was the city willing to do, to step up and do, and things like that. And the city really didn't want to operate the program. That just kind of wasn't in their wheelhouse. But Cap Metro really wanted to kind of control more because there was about maybe a year and a half or so, maybe 2 years of working with the nonprofit and trying to support and kind of integrate. And it became very clear that that Cap Metro really wanted to have a little more control over that. But yeah, it has to start with some, champions to work it through. And it's not clean by any stretch of the imagination, and it was a challenge for a nonprofit to suddenly roll into a transit agency. And there was a lot of good to that, because obviously like like the nonprofit was like 13 people, and so it was good that we now have this agency and we have all of these departments and resources that as a nonprofit did not have. The challenge also came in to now there's other people involved. And so understanding and trying to figure out what's going to stay within, the operations team, and then how are other things being handled. IT wanted more control, and, operations was like, no, 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 no. And so we had to have a lot of conversation about what bike share is, and for the transit agency to really, and the people to understand it's not like running a fixed route bus, system. And, so it's been this back and forth between, the positives and some that were a little more challenging to really handle. But we've worked through it, and, everyone on both sides have been real positive about the changeover, and as well as the city. So we just all meet and we all work together. One of the things we have, depending on what's going on, like weekly meetings with the city. And now that we have this new TASA grant, and we have the new vendor, we're putting together this working group to figure out how we're going to expand over the next few years, and how to deal with the ILA and the contracts and all of that. So we've got a working group now that meets on a regular basis just to have that open communication.
I can just say that also, being there, these conversations started at the end of my period when I was running the bike share system. And I do think moving it over to the transit agency was a great move, because the city was often conflicted about bike share, because they also had to regulate all of the private vendors, the scooters, stockless bike share. So that's one question I have, which is, how does that fit in? You're operating as a public system, but you also have, and I don't know the last numbers, how many scooters and bikes, electric bikes and things you have from vendors like Lime and Bird and people like that. How does that fit into, I guess, your work with the city or your planning, or do you just, is that not something you focus on? You're just focusing on rolling out your program?
Yeah, we're not really focused on it. A lot of vendors have left, as they have with many cities. We don't really run into too many obstacles with that, because the city does manage that. And that's Mike Kimbrough now. I didn't know if you knew that, Elliot.
Oh, no, I didn't. Yeah, he used to work for us. He was in operations 2 people after you.
Yeah, and then he went to UT and did some work there, and then he went to the city. I don't know, not that long ago, maybe 6 months. And so, we talk. The biggest obvious thing with the private vendors is, they like to consume some of our space, and they try to dock the scooters into, the station and things like that. But outside of that, we don't really interact with them that much. And like I said, a lot have left. The numbers out are much, number of vehicles and stuff is a lot less. And they really are in the outskirts of things. And it's not really, at this point, we're not really expanding in some of those areas. Down the road we will, but we haven't seen much conflict with it. But again, I think it's just the vast numbers that were there originally, when they were just dropping, scooters everywhere. And I don't think we even have any bikes left. I don't think there are any bikes, you know, in the city. I think that vendor also left. So it's, I was concerned about it originally, but it really hasn't seemed to raise its ugly head too terribly much. And again, you know, having the reliability, and that was also some conversations that we were having with the city, because we were like, when we were doing the RFP, do we consider having a dockless solution, you know, as a opening it up for a vendor? And pretty much, I mean, the city didn't want that, Cat Metro didn't want that, and the general, you know, public that was involved in these discussions really didn't want that either. And so, you know, so we limited, and we didn't really limit it to just what is the traditional station and docks. We did open it up to any vendor that could provide a lock to solution. But the problem with that is all of the other requirements of electrification and things like that really kind of ruled them out anyway. But we did open it up in case Cat Metro, new to bike share, they didn't know what vendors were out there. They didn't know what kind of equipment was, you know, available, new technology, things like that. So we did write the RFP pretty broad so that we could look at all of the options that are out there.
See if folks have other questions before we let Jamie go. I do have a question, one other follow-up question about kind of how you're looking to further integrate transit with bike share. So one of the things I know LA Metro does, they have a B-cycle system right now, though that may change as well. They're in the middle of kind of a redo of their contracts as well. But they've done it as a really integrating with their fares with the bike share system. So you can use basically a transfer from a bus or subway to be able to check out a bike. Is that something you guys are thinking about on kind of price integration or fare integration, or is it going to be kind of still a separate service?
So we have talked a lot about that. That is a hot item. You know, Cat Metro does want to provide that. We, as a transit agency, I think we have 4 or 5 different apps. So we need, the transit side of things needs to get on one app before. So where Cat Metro Bike Share is our new app. So it's kind of separated. We've had a lot of conversations about that. So one of the things, being in the planning department, we have these new rapid, Metro rapid stations. And so by being in planning, it was really great because as they were planning those, I'm like, oh, give me a little more concrete. Oh, wait a minute, give me some, you know, conduit, and we'll make it electrified. And so we've been able to do that. And again, I think that's why it's a good idea to have somebody overseeing this in the planning department, because I'm exposed to everything that the you know, agency is doing and where we're expanding and what trails are happening and things like that outside of what the city is doing. And so, what, you know, kind of as a side note to that, but yes, we do want to have integrated fares. Right now, we didn't have everything together for the launch. So we just kind of launched separately, and we just kept the pricing that we already had. You know, the downside to working for an agency is we're not as nimble in decision making as we were used to. So, you know, you've got a lot of legislation, a lot of rules and regulations that we have to follow. But yes, the intent is to be able to do that and have some kind of combination pass and be able to, go from one to the other. We're having a whole big agency fair discussion next year. And so, I've made sure like bike share is part of that conversation, and how do we want to do that fare structure, and then, like how do we implement that, and how do our customers take advantage of some combo passes or transfers or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely on a very hot item. But with an agency, it has bigger conversations that take way longer. So yeah, we're learning to adjust the timeline on what we can implement and when. So yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, I appreciate the time, and feel free. I mean, Elliot knows how to reach me. You can always send me an email or something. It's just jd.simpson@catmetro.org, and I'll be glad to answer what I can. We do have a lot of things on the horizon. And one of the things too for funding, like operational funding, I'll just throw this out there, is we are able to provide sponsors or advertising on our bikes and stations. Again, the way we set it up, we have that flexibility to do that. So our operational expenses will be supplemented not only by fares, and also the city's contribution, but we will be, I guess, selling advertising or sponsorships is the right term, for the program to supplement the operational expenses. And so, again, that's coming. It's in the works. We're going through selecting an agency to do all of that, and then working with the city on regulation there. They still don't allow, we're still constrained by the size of the map end, and it has to be static. We don't have, yet anyway, we don't have the ability to go digital, but it's in the works. So.
Yeah, we had, there were some limitations too that were state limitations. So the legislature did change that here as well.
Yeah.
For bike and transit infrastructure. So,
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. I will stop the recording
Okay.
here. And